Okay, today we will be talking about Andrew Jackson. He was our seventh president, and he was so important that they called his time in the presidency called the Jacksonian era. It's really going to make a fundamental change to how America works. So this is the thesis. While white lower class men gained rights during the Jacksonian era, natives and other minorities did not. Now that did not change, unfortunately, but we do finally get lower class white men having a lot more power. And we're going to talk about King Andrew. Let's get to the outline. That Andrew Jackson was called common man. He was called King Andrew, just the way he was acting. And we're going to talk about the Trail of Tears, which was very important. And then we're also going to talk about rioting during this time, which is pretty relevant today. Andrew Jackson was known as the common man's president and or King Andrew, and we're going to go through each one. So please take a couple of notes. You'll need this for later. So here we go. Jackson forever, the man of the people, because the power derived from the people. So before this, the first six presidents, it was very much the elite who would elect, and landowners and so forth. And with Jackson now, we're going to get a lot more, like we said, lower class white men who are going to be able to vote. So Jackson is definitely appealing to that. And the first thing under common man is that Jackson said that he was a representative, not a guide. So usually I'd be able to ask you about this, but a guide is, of course, somebody who's telling you what to think, right, or telling you which way to go. And Jackson, he argued that he would listen to the people and follow what they had to say. One of the things he did as a common man's president is he opened the White House for his inauguration. So here you can see all kinds of people going in, and he actually installed these spittoons, which were places where men could be, chewing on their tobacco and then spit into them. So you can see it's kind of more of a working class environment. In fact, it got so crowded that Jackson actually escaped out the back window. Okay, here's a picture of a gentleman, and he's doing what's called stump speaking, S-T-U-M-P. So he's standing on a tree stump, or so, pretending to, whatever, and he's sharing his political beliefs. So this was really encouraged during this time, that lots of people would share their political beliefs. Okay, so that's under the common man. Another one is that he broke down the U.S. Bank. So the U.S. Bank was run by elites, and you can tell by this cartoon that the person who drew this cartoon didn't like the U.S. Bank, right, because they've got a devil running around. And supposedly, Jackson was standing for the people, right, by tearing down this bank. Fortunately, it did lead to some kind of big economic problems. Okay, now this isn't really how Jackson would dress, but this is somebody making fun of him, calling him King Andrew. And we're going to find out that even though he was the common man's president, common man, white man's president, he enjoyed using power. And we're going to see a few ways that he did that with the source and with some different examples. So actually for question one, it's about how he vetoed. And Jackson vetoed 12 times versus the previous six presidents combined 9 times. So take a look at this question. What statement was President Jackson making with his use of the veto? What was the argument against his action? So don't just go by this quote here. I need you to go into the source for full credit. But when you are vetoing, when a president is vetoing, who are they going against? They're going against Congress, right? Now, today, presidents veto hundreds of times, but he really, made that step of saying, I'm an independent party and I can veto any, gosh darn time that I want to. Okay, we're going to get to Rachel in just a second, his wife, but let me tell you a couple more things that he was with the King Andrew. Let me go back to this picture. So we're going to talk about the Trail of Tears, where he went against the Supreme Court. We already saw he went against Congress. He is also going to go against the states. South Carolina is going to want to leave the Union because they say that the Constitution doesn't completely fulfill what they want. Jackson definitely fights against that and says, that is not okay. Now, later on, South Carolina actually is going to leave the Union with the Civil War. And remember that because it'll be the first state to do that. But here, you can see King Andrew going against Congress, going against the Supreme Court. We'll talk about in a minute, going against the states and saying, you're an independent party. Remember all these for some questions you're going to be asked later. Okay, so with Rachel Jackson, this just shows again a story about Jackson's character, which you'll find out. But the story goes is that well, first off, there was a TV show that talked about really kind of nasty elections. And I would say the one, recent wasn't the greatest, right? I mean, so far as it was pretty nasty. But supposedly, when Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams, he lost at first, the first time, because John Quincy Adams they kind of came to a tie. And then there was some elite people that, in the House that voted Quincy in. But then the second time that they ran against each other, Jackson actually won. But the argument was that Jackson accused Quincy Adams of giving money to the Russian Tsar for a mistress. Well, Quincy Adams accused Rachel Jackson of bigamy. Rachel Jackson had been married before. She thought her divorce went through before she married Andrew Jackson, but unfortunately it had not. So the persecution on her was so intense that she actually died, and she was buried in her inauguration gown. So in defense of his wife, whom he loved very much, Jackson fought 103 duels. Now, if you know what a duel is, you insult each other, right? And then maybe slap each other, and then you walk some paces backward, right? You turn around, walk backward, and then you shoot. Well, you're supposed to not kill the other person, but Jackson actually did kill somebody one time, and another time there was a bullet that went right next to his heart, which was so close to his heart they couldn't operate. So imagine how Jackson was going into the presidency. He's lost his beloved wife. She went through horrible times beforehand. He has a bullet, lodged right next to his heart. He's extremely tall and extremely thin. And they did this procedure where they would try to bleed you. That was like the medical procedure that actually ended up killing George Washington. But that's how they believed to help you. And so he is not in a good mood, right? Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Trail of Tears, which was a huge important part. And this is all going to tie in again with the King Andrew. But let's take a look at this. You don't need to answer this on any, homework, but please pay attention to it because it's going to really matter in understanding what exactly happened. So it's kind of what's called a fun quiz. You don't have to know the answers. Just pay attention when I tell you the answers. So the Cherokee Nation established a form of government very similar to the U.S. government. 2, the Cherokee man Sequoyah, also known as George Gist or Gist, did something no North American human had ever done before. What was it? He created a written language. 3, which of the following did the Cherokee not have in 1838? It was C, a gambling casino. So they had a constitution, newspaper, official records. 4, the Cherokees wrote the first Indian newspaper in 1828. It was called the Cherokee Phoenix. It was unusual because it was C, written in English and Cherokee. 9, in the early part of the 19th century, some Cherokees owned African slaves. I want to stop for a minute here because a lot of times my African American students will point to some Native American blood. So yes, there was intermarriage, but there's also a little bit more of a complicated relationship between natives and African Americans. For example, here the natives owned African slaves. When we get to the Civil War, there's going to be something called the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were African American Indian hunters. So again, sometimes they got along, and sometimes it was a little bit not getting along. 6, in the early part of the 19th century, most Cherokees wore C, European clothes. 7, in the early part of the 19th century, many Cherokees were, imagine you can know what this is, Christians. 8, in the early part of the 19th century, most Cherokees wore, you'd probably think it was B or something, but it was actually D, turbans. 9, when the Removal Act was passed in 1830, the Cherokee Nation was A, fought it in court. 10, in the Cherokee family, who was considered the head of the household. Please go back to remember our first lectures. It was B, the woman. 11, in the Cherokee family, who owned most of the property, was B, the woman. And just kind of a fun one was John Ross, number 12. Chief of the Cherokees had a house. C, designed by a Philadelphia architect. So what's my point here? It's that the Cherokee, I hate to use the word civilized, but they were actually part of what was called the civilized tribes. Were they very white Americanized, if you know what I mean? So this is a picture of a Cherokee in a turban. Here's another one, and he's looking at the written language. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what happened with the Trail of Tears. And first we start off, a lot of them were in Georgia. This is going to be taking them from Georgia to Oklahoma with the Trail of Tears, but they start off in Georgia. And there was a movement in the 1800s. This white lady down there is actually probably a nice person, but what she's trying to do is convince the natives to live on their own separate land because they believe that that would make them Americanized, and for the men to farm, which we already know it's the women that farm, right? So what ended up happening, though, unfortunately, is some not so nice people came along and would say to these natives with individual allotments of land, hey, I know you go hunting in the winter. Can you sign this paper so I can use your land? Well, the natives say, sure. The land's not mine. Everybody could use it. Well, unfortunately, when they came back from hunting, the whites would say, what do you think? Oh, yeah, you signed this paper, you lost your land. So they lost, 2/3 to 3/5 of their land. But that still wasn't enough for Jackson. And this is actually going to show how much land they had to begin, and then the red is what they ended up with. So you don't need to write this down, but just go through this with me, is that gold is discovered on Cherokee land. So President Jackson does the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Then the Supreme Court rules pro-Georgia and anti-Native and says, no, the natives need to give up this land. But in 1832, the Supreme Court says, no, that's wrong. The natives need to have this land. I believe they consider them an independent nation. Well, Jackson, just like he did with Congress, just like he did with the state, says, nope, I don't care. I'm going to get what I want. And then we also have the Treaty of New Dakota, where 100 Cherokees sign away their land and other natives warn they will die as a result. Not because the natives are going to kill them, but that the Cherokees will die as a result of giving away this land, just because of, fate or whatever. And they actually did all die. But 1838, we're going to have the Trail of Tears. We're going to have 17,000 natives that are being moved. 4,000 are going to die along the way. And this is where they were moved from Georgia to Oklahoma. We're going to take a look at some primary sources, and you'll have some questions. But this is one primary source. I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet point into stockades. I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep. Here's a survivor of the march. Long time we travel on way to new land. People feel bad when they leave old nation. Women cry and make sad wails. Children cry and many men cry. Very many people die. So question 2, take a look at this longer source again. If you just use my quote that I give you, I won't give you very much credit. I need you to look at the source. How specifically did Chief John Ross argue the natives are being denied their constitutional rights and their Christian rights? Be sure to give me some quotes with that. And then also regarding a soldier across the Trail of Tears, you're a white or a native witness who is for the forced removal. Actually, it should be the white is for the forced removal. The native would not be, so that's not written correctly. Tell us your impressions. Okay, so you can either be a native who's watching or the white that's for it. Okay, or you maybe can be a white against it. Yeah. Okay, so 4,000 died, like we said. This is a famous picture depicting what was going on. And the Cherokee rose was supposedly a flower that grew along the side of the trail where the mother's tears would fall. Now, this is interesting. Andrew Jackson, supposedly is a very plain speaker, but he gets kind of fancy when he's trying to get away with stuff. So here it says, true philanthropy reconciles the mind of these vicissitudes as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. So he's saying it would be truly loving that if we get used to the idea that one generation needs to become extinct. And I have a textbook where it shows what was being taught to children in these one-room schoolhouses. And that's actually what they were teaching in the 1830s, is that it's time for the natives to die. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the last topic, which is, I think, really interesting, and it's about rioting. And I want you to think about, we have definitely had our share of rioting. Take a look at this. So it's a little similar. So within his Jackson's first 5 years, we have 20 riots. Remember, it's a lot smaller country, too. 1834, we have 16. 1835, 37. So what I want you to do is, a lot of these questions, I'm not going to give you direct answers. I just want you to think about it. And before we get into this first question, what I want you to think about is, especially if you're 18 or 19 years old, the country is not chronologically that old, but they are kind of psychologically that old. And think about, a lot of you are brand new freshmen, but think about some of your friends that are maybe not making the best decisions during this time. Again, you're online, so maybe you don't know, but maybe friends that decided not to go to college or whatever. And just what happens when you have absolute freedom and you're kind of young. So that's what's happening with our country. So question 4, why is freedom essential to our country? In what ways must order balance freedom in order for us to function? Okay, you think about that as a student that's been able to sign up for an online class your freshman year. Good job. Okay, question 5, you live in 1930. How much should the government be in charge? What are your concerns at this stage? Remember, we just got rid of the government, okay, with the American Revolution. Question 6, now these terms I need you to pay attention to. Benevolent, what do you think that means? So think about benevolent, which means, the doing of good, and then also violent. So what do you think that means? What does that term have to do with mobs? Number 7, another term maybe you haven't heard before, which is kind of made up, but it's how can a mob be a super legal executor? So when you're thinking about math, super means above, right? So it's above the law. How do you think that means? And just so you know, we have a great history of riots from England. So that's why they have the House of Commons, because they want the lower class to be able to speak up. And that's a lot of what's going on here. Okay, so what about Jackson encouraged rioting? I gave you some stories, so make sure to use those. Now, Jackson hated rioting, but he actually was involved in encouraging it. And again, I want some other answers for the ones before, but you can use some of these examples too. But for example, he was pro-slavery, and he wanted, he said that in the South that they should list all of the abolitionists, the people against slavery, and not give them their mail. So, abolitionists in the South, that's not going to go very well. Another time there was somebody in the West that they were having some problems with, and he just said lynch them. So he, really acted outside of the law, didn't he? Okay, so who were the rioters? They were usually white, young males. And when were they successful? They would be successful when they could go after people that really couldn't fight back. So there's going to be some wealthy African Americans. They were obviously free in the North, like in Philadelphia, and people went after them quite a bit because it was hard for them to fight back. They didn't do so well when they went after large groups. Like, let's say if you went after the Catholic Church, or for example, the Mormon Church, they did kill, we're going to talk about that later, but the leader, and then he became a martyr, right? So that's when it didn't go as well. So here's a picture of Jackson fighting. I don't know if he really was, but I'm just showing what's going on. And here's a picture of this, the Congress fighting. So take a look at these next documents. So Washington Irving is going to this New York theater, and I want you to see what was happening. And just so you know, I actually went to that theater, and we went to see the Blue Man Group, and we were in the last row in the top in the back. So I went forward to the railing, and it would be very hard from down below to see what was going on up above, just to let you know the way that the theater is built. The other thing you should know is there actually was a riot that killed people over Shakespeare. So that was the Astor Place riot, and there was a kind of a snobby Englishman actor, and people got really upset, and they had a riot, and there was some gunshots, and a number of people actually were killed over that. Okay, here's another one where they are going against an abolitionist press. These people they don't want slaves to be free or to have rights, a lot of them, because this would provide competition for them with jobs. So this is in the North. But take a look at these questions, okay? All right, so that is what we did today, and good job, everybody. Thank you very much.